Havana, 1961. A polished mahogany box of premium Cuban cigars sits elegantly on Fidel Castro's desk, wrapped in silk ribbon, a gift from an anonymous admirer. The revolutionary leader reaches for one, rolling it between his fingers, admiring the craftsmanship. What he doesn't know is that each cigar in that box has been meticulously prepared in a secret CIA laboratory in Virginia, treated with botulinum toxin so potent that a single puff could kill a man within hours. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was official United States policy. Over the next 5 decades, the Central Intelligence Agency would orchestrate more than 600 documented attempts to eliminate Fidel Castro, transforming America's premier intelligence agency into something resembling a deadly circus of failed plots. From exploding seashells strategically placed in his favorite Caribbean diving spots to a beautiful German lover armed with poison pills hidden in her cold cream, the CIA's obsession with the Cuban dictator spawned the most bizarre, elaborate, and ultimately futile assassination campaign in modern history. This is the story of how the Cold War's deadliest game of cat and mouse became an epic tale of survival, paranoia, and the terrifying lengths a superpower will go to eliminate one man. January 1, 1959. The date that changed everything. After years of guerrilla warfare in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, a bearded revolutionary named Fidel Castro marched victoriously into Havana at the head of a ragtag army that had defeated one of Latin America's most entrenched dictatorships. Fulgencio Batista, the American-backed strongman who had ruled Cuba with an iron fist, fled the island in the middle of the night, his private planes loaded with millions in stolen wealth. The Cuban people flooded the streets in celebration, tearing down Batista's monuments and embracing the charismatic young lawyer who promised to restore dignity, justice, and sovereignty to their nation. Castro was just 32 years old, tall and imposing, with piercing eyes that seemed to burn with revolutionary fervor. His speeches could last for hours, captivating audiences with his vision of a new Cuba, free from foreign domination and corrupt oligarchs. He spoke of land reform, literacy campaigns, and healthcare for all. To the poor farmers and urban workers who had suffered under Batista's regime, Fidel Castro was not a dictator in waiting but a liberator, a Cuban Robin Hood who had toppled the powerful to serve the powerless. In Washington, the initial reaction was uncertainty rather than outright hostility. President Dwight Eisenhower's administration adopted a wait-and-see approach. Yes, Castro was a radical, but perhaps he could be managed, influenced, or even controlled. The State Department sent cautious diplomatic feelers. Some in the CIA believed Castro might prove to be a useful counterweight to other radical movements in Latin America. For a brief moment, history hung in the balance. The relationship between the United States and revolutionary Cuba could have taken many different paths. Within months of taking power, Fidel Castro began a sweeping nationalization campaign that would fundamentally alter Cuba's relationship with the United States. American-owned sugar plantations, the lifeblood of Cuba's economy, were seized without compensation. Hotels, casinos, oil refineries, and telecommunication companies all fell under state control. In total, over $1 billion in American assets vanished overnight, transferred from corporate boardrooms in New York to revolutionary committees in Havana. The business community howled in protest. United Fruit Company executives demanded action. Casino owners with ties to organized crime saw their lucrative Caribbean empire crumble. Members of Congress received angry calls from constituents who had lost investments. The narrative in Washington shifted rapidly from cautious engagement to outright hostility. President Eisenhower, a man who had orchestrated successful coups in Iran and Guatemala, began to see Castro not as a nationalist reformer but as a communist threat just 90 miles from American shores. When Castro delivered a 4.5-hour speech to the United Nations in September 1960, denouncing American imperialism and comparing the United States to Nazi Germany, any remaining goodwill evaporated completely. But the final straw came when Castro began cozying up to the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev eagerly embraced the Cuban revolutionary, seeing an unprecedented opportunity to establish a communist foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Soviet oil, weapons, and economic aid began flowing to Cuba. Soviet advisors arrived in Havana. The nightmare scenario that had haunted American strategists since the end of World War II was materializing. The Cold War had arrived at America's doorstep. In March 1960, President Eisenhower made a fateful decision. He authorized the CIA to begin planning for Castro's removal, by any means necessary. The operation would be called Pluto, and it would include not just political undermining or economic pressure, but something far more direct: the physical elimination of Fidel Castro himself. When John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961, He inherited Eisenhower's anti-Castro plans, including a CIA-trained invasion force of Cuban exiles preparing to retake their homeland. Kennedy, young and untested, approved the operation despite significant reservations from his military advisors. On April 17, 1961, approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles stormed the beaches at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast. The invasion was a catastrophic failure. Castro's forces, far better prepared than the CIA had anticipated, quickly surrounded and defeated the invaders. Within 3 days, the exile army had been destroyed. More than 100 were killed and over 1,200 were captured. Kennedy, humiliated on the world stage, took full public responsibility for the debacle. But privately he was furious. He blamed the CIA for faulty intelligence and poor planning. He vowed that the agency would pay for embarrassing him so early in his presidency. But Kennedy's anger was nothing compared to that of his younger brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy took the Bay of Pigs failure personally. He became obsessed with making Castro pay for the humiliation, transforming the Castro problem into a Kennedy family vendetta. Robert Kennedy began attending CIA meetings, demanding action, pushing for more aggressive operations, and making it clear that eliminating Castro was a top priority for the administration. In November 1961, the Kennedy administration launched Operation Mongoose, the most extensive covert operation ever directed at a single individual. The operation had virtually unlimited funding, a staff of over 400 CIA officers, and a singular mission: remove Fidel Castro from power, preferably by killing him. Edward Lansdale, a legendary CIA operative who had conducted successful counterinsurgency operations in the Philippines and Vietnam, was put in charge. The guidelines for Operation Mongoose were chillingly simple: use sabotage, propaganda, economic warfare, and, if possible, assassination to destabilize the Castro regime. No tactic was off the table. No plot was too outlandish to consider. The United States government had essentially given the CIA a license to kill, and the agency was about to get creative in ways that would shock even hardened intelligence professionals. The hunt for Fidel Castro had officially begun, and it would spawn some of the most bizarre and disturbing chapters in American intelligence history. In a secret laboratory hidden within the CIA's Technical Services Division in Virginia, scientists and engineers who normally worked on spy gadgets and surveillance equipment were given an unusual assignment: devise creative ways to assassinate the Cuban leader. What followed was a darkly inventive catalog of murder methods that read like rejected plots from a spy novel. The exploding cigar became perhaps the most infamous of these schemes. CIA chemists developed cigars that looked, felt, and smelled identical to Castro's preferred Cohiba brand, but were packed with a small explosive charge designed to detonate when lit. The blast wouldn't be large enough to harm bystanders, but would be sufficient to blow off Castro's face at close range. The Technical Services Division was quite proud of this innovation. They tested prototypes on mannequins, perfecting the timing and explosive yield. The only problem was delivery. Getting the doctored cigars into Castro's personal humidor proved impossible. His security detail screened every gift, every package, every item that came near the Cuban leader. So they tried poison instead. The same technical services team produced cigars contaminated with botulinum toxin, one of the most lethal substances known to science. Just a tiny amount absorbed through the mouth or lungs would cause progressive paralysis, respiratory failure, and death within days. These cigars didn't need to explode, they just needed to be smoked. Again, the cigars were manufactured to perfection, indistinguishable from the real thing. And again, they never reached their target. The CIA knew Castro was an avid scuba diver who regularly explored the coral reefs off the Cuban coast, often with minimal security. This hobby presented opportunities. Agency operatives developed a diving suit contaminated with fungal spores designed to cause a chronic skin disease called Madura foot, which would be both debilitating and humiliating. They also prepared a wetsuit dusted with tubercle bacilli, the bacteria that causes tuberculosis. The idea was to give Castro a slow-acting disease that would gradually weaken and kill him while appearing natural. But the Technical Services Division wasn't finished. They concocted an even more theatrical plot involving a large, spectacular seashell. Knowing Castro often collected shells during his dives, they created a beautiful specimen, hollowed it out, and packed it with explosives and a pressure-sensitive trigger. The plan was for CIA operatives to plant it in one of Castro's known diving locations. When the Cuban leader picked up the lovely shell to examine it, the device would detonate, killing him instantly. The shell was constructed, tested, and prepared for deployment. But ultimately the logistics proved too complicated. How could they guarantee Castro would find this specific shell among thousands? How could they place it without being detected by Cuban security patrols? The exploding seashell, like so many other plots, remained an ingenious idea that never saw execution. Perhaps the strangest scheme in the poisoner's playbook involved thallium salts, a toxic chemical compound that causes hair loss. The CIA's psychological warfare experts believed that destroying Castro's iconic beard would undermine his revolutionary image and authority. A leader without his beard, they theorized, would lose his mystique and power among the Cuban people. So they prepared a compound that could be dusted into Castro's shoes during a foreign trip. The thallium would be absorbed through his skin, causing his beard to fall out dramatically within weeks. The plot was ready to be executed during Castro's 1960 trip to New York for the United Nations General Assembly. CIA agents had access to his hotel room and had obtained identical shoes to practice on. But at the last moment, Castro's security team changed his accommodations, and the opportunity evaporated. Each of these plots shared common features: creative thinking, meticulous planning, significant resources invested in development, and ultimately, complete failure. The CIA was learning a hard lesson. Killing a paranoid dictator surrounded by a sophisticated intelligence service was far more difficult than overthrowing governments in countries with weak security apparatus. By 1960, the CIA was becoming desperate. Traditional intelligence operations weren't working. The Technical Services Division's creative poisons hadn't reached their target. The agency needed help from people with experience in murder, people who operated outside normal legal constraints, people who had their own reasons to want Castro dead. They needed the mafia. Before Castro's revolution, Havana had been the crown jewel of American organized crime. Under Batista's complicit regime, mobsters like Meyer Lansky, Santos Traficante, and Sam Giancana had transformed the Cuban capital into a paradise of gambling, prostitution, and drug trafficking. The casinos alone generated tens of millions of dollars annually for the mob. The Tropicana, the Riviera, the Capri, the Nacional, all controlled by American crime families. It was closer than Las Vegas, with looser regulations, cheaper labor, and a government that could be easily bribed. Then Castro came to power and shut it all down. The casinos were nationalized or closed. The mobsters were expelled or arrested. Santos Traficante spent months in a Cuban prison before being released and deported. The mob lost hundreds of millions in investments and future revenue. These were not men who forgave easily. They wanted Castro dead almost as badly as the CIA did. The agency's liaison for this unholy alliance was Robert Maheu, a former FBI agent who now worked as a private investigator with extensive underworld connections. In September 1960, Maheu was instructed to make contact with organized crime figures and feel out their interest in a Castro assassination. The approach would be indirect. The mafia would never be told they were working for the United States government. Instead, Maheu would present the plot as a business proposition from wealthy Cuban exiles who wanted their country back. Maheu reached out to Johnny Rosselli, a powerful Los Angeles mobster with connections throughout the criminal underworld. Rosselli was intrigued but wanted to bring in bigger players. He arranged meetings with Sam Giancana, the ruthless boss of the Chicago outfit, and Santos Traficante, who had personal experience in Cuba and still maintained contacts on the island. The three mobsters agreed to help, not for money which they had in abundance, but for the chance to reclaim their Cuban empire. The mob's approach was characteristically direct: poison. Traficante knew people in Havana, people who worked in restaurants and hotels that Castro frequented. The CIA provided 6 poison capsules, each filled with botulinum toxin at a concentration that would kill within hours of ingestion. The pills were designed to dissolve in liquid, making them ideal for slipping into a drink or food. They were supposedly tasteless, odorless, and undetectable. The pills were smuggled to Cuba and given to Juan Orta, an official in Castro's government who had become disillusioned with the revolution and was secretly working with the CIA. Orta had access to Castro and could potentially poison his food or drinks. But Orta lost his nerve. He kept the pills but never used them. Eventually, he became convinced he was under suspicion and sought asylum in the Venezuelan embassy in Havana. The poison pills were never recovered. The CIA gave the mob more pills and recruited other potential assassins. One was Antonio Veciana, a Cuban exile militant. Another was Marita Lorenz, but her story deserves its own chapter in this dark tale. In 1959, a 19-year-old German-American woman named Marita Lorenz arrived in Havana aboard a cruise ship where her father worked as captain. She was beautiful, adventurous, and curious about the revolution everyone was talking about. At a reception, she met Fidel Castro. The chemistry was immediate and intense. Castro, then 33 and at the height of his revolutionary charisma, was captivated by the young woman. He invited her to stay in Cuba. She accepted. For several months, Marita Lorenz became Castro's lover. She lived in the Havana Hilton, which Castro had commandeered as his headquarters. She attended his speeches, accompanied him on trips around the island, and by her own account, fell deeply in love with the Cuban leader. She became pregnant with his child. But the relationship ended abruptly when Cuban security officials, suspicious of her background and her father's American connections, forcibly sent her back to the United States. The pregnancy ended either through miscarriage or abortion. Accounts vary. Back in America, Lorenz was heartbroken and angry. She was also vulnerable, which made her a perfect CIA recruitment target. In 1960, CIA officers approached her with a proposition. They knew about her relationship with Castro. They knew she could get close to him again if she wanted. Would she be willing to go back to Cuba? Would she be willing to help her adopted country? Would she be willing to kill the man who had sent her away? The CIA trained Lorenz in basic espionage techniques and gave her 2 poison capsules hidden inside a jar of cold cream. The pills were similar to those given to the mafia, designed to dissolve quickly in liquid. Her mission was simple: resume her relationship with Castro, wait for the right moment, slip the poison into his drink, and leave Cuba immediately afterward. In early 1961, Lorenz returned to Havana. Castro surprisingly agreed to see her. She was taken to his room at the Hilton. According to Lorenz's testimony years later, Castro was expecting her. He knew why she had come. As she stood there with her jar of cold cream containing the poison capsules, Castro handed her his pistol. "Did you come to kill me?" he asked directly. She couldn't deny it. She couldn't complete the mission. Instead, she broke down. Whether Castro's counterintelligence service had warned him, whether he had simply guessed based on the circumstances of her return, or whether the whole scene was psychological theater, Lorenz never tried to poison him. She left Cuba shortly afterward and would spend decades telling and retelling this story to journalists, investigators, and anyone who would listen. Marita Lorenz wasn't the only woman recruited to kill Castro. The CIA approached several other women with access to the Cuban leader, including his former secretary and a nightclub performer he had been involved with. None succeeded. None even came close. Castro's ability to survive these plots seemed to involve a combination of excellent counterintelligence, personal paranoia, and uncanny luck. The female assassination plots revealed something disturbing about the CIA's operations during this period. The agency was willing to exploit personal relationships, manipulate vulnerable individuals, and use sex as a weapon. These were not abstract military operations or strategic strikes. These were intimate betrayals, using love and desire as cover for murder. The moral boundaries that normally constrained intelligence operations had been abandoned in the obsessive pursuit of one man. As the 1960s progressed and the obvious approaches to assassination continued failing, the CIA's Technical Services Division descended further into the realm of bizarre and increasingly desperate schemes. The agency was spending millions of dollars and employing some of America's brightest scientists, all focused on the singular problem of how to kill Fidel Castro without leaving obvious American fingerprints. One elaborate plan involved creating a fake underwater documentary. The CIA would produce what appeared to be an innocent film about Caribbean marine life and offer it to Castro as a gift, knowing his interest in diving and oceanography. Hidden within the film would be propaganda designed to undermine his authority. But the plan had a darker element. The film crew would scout Castro's favorite diving locations and plant various booby traps. Mines disguised as coral formations, explosive devices inside shells, or even trained predatory fish released in areas where Castro swam. The plan was shelved when analysts realized the impossibility of controlling so many variables in an underwater environment. The depilatory powder scheme resurfaced multiple times in different forms. Beyond the thallium salts in shoes, CIA chemists developed an aerosol spray that could be secretly deployed in Castro's bedroom or office. The chemicals would settle on surfaces and be absorbed through skin contact, causing rapid hair loss. Again, the psychological warfare unit was convinced that a beardless Castro would lose his authority. Again, the delivery mechanism proved impossible to implement. Castro's living arrangements were kept secret, with multiple residences and unpredictable movement patterns. One of the most scientifically sophisticated plots involved a rare neurological toxin derived from shellfish. The poison could cause symptoms resembling a stroke or heart attack, making Castro's death appear natural. The challenge was dosage and delivery. Too much would cause obvious poisoning symptoms. Too little would merely make him sick. The CIA needed someone with medical knowledge who could calibrate the dose precisely and had access to administer it. They recruited a Cuban doctor who worked in a clinic that Castro occasionally visited. The doctor was given the toxin and trained in its use. But Castro stopped coming to that clinic before the plot could be executed. Whether his security services had detected the compromise or whether it was mere chance remained unknown. The Technical Services Division even explored using biological warfare agents. Documents declassified decades later revealed discussions about dengue fever, designed to cause a debilitating illness that might incapacitate Castro long enough for a coup to remove him. Other documents mentioned investigations into exotic parasites found in the Cuban environment that might be weaponized. None of these biological schemes moved beyond the theoretical stage, partly due to concerns about controllability and partly because of the risks of international condemnation if biological weapons were traced back to the United States. While the CIA scientists were concocting exotic poisons and elaborate schemes, the agency's paramilitary division was pursuing more direct approaches. Multiple assassination teams were trained and infiltrated into Cuba with orders to kill Castro using conventional weapons. These teams faced enormous challenges. Cuba's security apparatus, trained by Soviet advisors and paranoid by nature, had created a surveillance state where foreign agents stood little chance of operating undetected. Every neighborhood had its Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, local watch groups that reported suspicious activity. The Cuban Intelligence Service, the DGI, had proven surprisingly effective at identifying and capturing CIA operatives. One notable attempt came in 1971 when Castro traveled to Chile to meet with President Salvador Allende. The CIA worked with right-wing Chilean groups to organize an assassination during Castro's visit. Sniper positions were identified overlooking the route his motorcade would take. Weapons were smuggled to the hit team. Reconnaissance was thorough. But at the last moment, Castro's security detail changed the route based on intelligence they had received. Whether the Cubans had penetrated the plot or were simply being cautiously paranoid, the result was the same: another failure. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, several infiltration teams were captured soon after arriving in Cuba. Some were tried publicly in show trials where they confessed to working for the CIA and plotting Castro's assassination. Others simply disappeared into Cuba's prison system. The human cost of these operations was significant, though rarely acknowledged publicly. Cuban exiles who volunteered for these missions believing they were striking a blow for freedom often ended up dead or imprisoned for decades. What frustrated the CIA most was the realization that Castro seemed to know about many plots before they could be executed. His intelligence network had clearly penetrated Cuban exile groups in Miami and possibly even CIA operational units. Double agents were feeding information back to Havana. The hunter was being hunted, and the Cuban dictator was proving to be a master of counterintelligence. By the mid-1970s, the Castro assassination programs had consumed enormous resources. Conservative estimates placed the cost at over $100 million, though the true figure was certainly higher when accounting for all the black budget operations, the Technical Services Division's research, and the payments to assets and informants. This was money that could have been used for legitimate intelligence gathering or countering actual Soviet threats elsewhere in the world. But the cost wasn't just financial. The obsession with killing Castro had corrupted the CIA itself. The agency had partnered with mafia criminals. It had developed poisons and weapons that violated international conventions. It had manipulated vulnerable individuals and destroyed lives in pursuit of an operation that was producing no results. Officers who questioned the effectiveness or morality of these operations found their careers stalled. The institutional culture of the CIA during this period became defined by this single failing mission. Then in 1975, everything came crashing down. Senator Frank Church, a Democrat from Idaho, launched a comprehensive investigation into American intelligence abuses. The Church Committee, as it became known, subpoenaed CIA documents and forced current and former officers to testify under oath. The resulting revelations shocked the American public. The committee exposed not just the Castro assassination plots but a much broader pattern of illegal CIA activities, including domestic surveillance, drug experiments on unwitting subjects, and involvement in coups that overthrew democratically elected governments. But the Castro plots captured the public imagination because of their sheer absurdity. Major newspapers ran stories with headlines like "CIA's Exploding Cigars" and "The Spy Agency That Couldn't Shoot Straight." The testimony was often darkly comic. One CIA officer had to explain the exploding seashell plot to skeptical senators. Another described the poisoned wetsuit scheme in excruciating detail. The partnership with organized crime figures seemed particularly troubling, raising questions about whether the agency had become indistinguishable from the criminals it was supposed to be investigating. International reaction was fierce. American allies expressed dismay that the CIA had been operating assassination squads. The United Nations condemned the plots. Fidel Castro himself held a press conference where he mocked the CIA's incompetence and claimed that his counterintelligence services had documented 638 separate assassination attempts, a number that seemed impossibly high until investigators realized it might actually be conservative. The Church Committee's findings led to significant reforms. President Gerald Ford issued an executive order banning political assassinations. Congressional oversight of intelligence operations was strengthened. The CIA's freewheeling days of operating without supervision were over. But the damage to America's reputation and to the agency's credibility was profound and lasting. What the CIA failed to understand for many years was that Fidel Castro wasn't just a target surviving through luck. He was an active participant in the game, manipulating the hunters even as they pursued him. Cuban intelligence operations under Castro were far more sophisticated than the CIA ever wanted to admit. Castro's security chief, Fabian Escalante, later revealed the extent of Cuba's counterintelligence penetration of American operations. Cuban agents had infiltrated Cuban exile groups in Miami who were working with the CIA. They had double agents inside organizations like Alpha 66 and Omega 7 that were conducting paramilitary operations against Cuba. Some of the people the CIA thought were its assets were actually reporting back to Havana. This penetration meant that Castro often knew about assassination plots before they could be executed. He knew about the poison pills given to Juan Orta. He knew about the sniper team's training in Central America. He knew about the CIA's recruitment of his former associates. This knowledge gave him an enormous strategic advantage. He could prepare defenses, change routines, and eliminate compromised associates before they could act. But Castro did something even more sophisticated. He used his knowledge of CIA plots for propaganda purposes. In speech after speech, he would reference American attempts to kill him, portraying himself as a lone revolutionary standing against a corrupt and murderous empire. Every failed assassination attempt strengthened his narrative and his grip on power. The CIA's operations were actually making Castro more secure, not less. Castro also engaged in psychological warfare against his would-be assassins. There are documented instances where he deliberately let CIA operatives know he was aware of their identities and missions. He would show up at locations where ambushes had been prepared, surrounded by extra security, essentially taunting the plotters. He gave interviews where he described specific plots in detail, demonstrating his intelligence services capabilities. This created a climate of paranoia among CIA officers, who became increasingly convinced that their operations were compromised from the start. The Cuban leader understood that his survival served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Cuban intelligence superiority. It embarrassed the United States. It provided endless material for propaganda. And perhaps most importantly, it reinforced his image as a revolutionary Superman who could not be killed by the empire. In Castro's hands, the CIA's assassination attempts became a tool for consolidating his own power. To understand how Fidel Castro survived 600 assassination attempts, you have to understand the security apparatus he constructed around himself. It was the product of deep paranoia, certainly, but also of brilliant operational security and Soviet training. Castro never slept in announced locations. His residences were secret, and he rotated between multiple secure facilities. Even high-ranking Cuban officials often didn't know where he spent the night. His movements were unpredictable and usually decided at the last moment. Motorcade routes were determined only minutes before departure, making it nearly impossible to position snipers or plant explosives. He employed body doubles, men who resembled him physically and were trained to mimic his gestures and speech patterns. These doubles would appear at public events while Castro watched from a distance or didn't attend at all. The confusion this created for intelligence services trying to track his movements was considerable. His food was tested by security personnel before he ate it. His water came from secured sources. His cigars were supplied through trusted channels and inspected before he smoked them. His clothing and personal items were screened for poisons and contaminants. The man lived in a constant state of security awareness that would be exhausting for most people but seemed to energize Castro. He maintained a sophisticated intelligence network that extended throughout Latin America and even into the United States. Cuban intelligence officers operated under diplomatic cover in embassies worldwide. They recruited sources among Cuban exiles, American leftists, and disaffected government employees. The information flowing back to Havana was extensive and often actionable. But beyond all the security measures and intelligence capabilities, Castro possessed something harder to quantify, an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. Associates described his paranoia as his greatest asset. He trusted no one completely. He assumed every gift might be poisoned, every new person a potential assassin, every plan a possible trap. This constant vigilance, combined with quick intelligence and decisive action, kept him alive when more trusting leaders would have died. The psychological toll of being the CIA's most wanted target for decades would break most people. Castro seemed to thrive on it. He wore the assassination attempts as a badge of honor, proof of his importance and his revolutionary credentials. He outlasted every American president who wanted him dead. He survived every CIA director who made killing him a priority. And in the end, he died in bed at age 90, his beard still intact, his revolution still in place, the ultimate winner of the deadliest game ever played. On November 25, 2016, Fidel Castro died of natural causes at his home in Havana. He was 90 years old and had ruled Cuba for 47 years before handing power to his brother Raúl in 2008. The revolutionary who survived 600 assassination attempts finally succumbed to the one enemy no security service can defeat: time. The irony was not lost on observers. Castro had outlived 11 American presidents, from Eisenhower to Obama. He had survived 7 CIA directors. He had watched the Soviet Union, the superpower that backed him, collapse and disappear. The Cold War that spawned the assassination attempts had ended decades earlier, yet Castro remained, a living anachronism, a revolutionary from another era who somehow persisted into the 21st century. When the Church Committee exposed the CIA's Castro plots in 1975, many Americans were shocked and embarrassed. How had their government descended to using mafia hitmen and exploding cigars? How had protecting national security turned into a decades-long obsession? With killing one foreign leader? The revelations damaged America's moral authority at a time when the nation was already reeling from Vietnam and Watergate. The long-term consequences of Operation Mongoose and its successor programs were significant. The CIA's reputation was tarnished, and the agency spent years rebuilding public trust. The partnership with organized crime figures created connections that would later complicate prosecutions of mob bosses. Some researchers have even suggested that the CIA's assassination infrastructure, once created, was turned against President Kennedy himself in 1963, though such theories remain speculative and controversial. For Cuba, the assassination attempts provided decades of propaganda material. Castro used them to justify his authoritarian control, arguing that Cuba was under constant siege from a hostile superpower. The plots gave him credibility among other Third World leaders who saw themselves as potential targets of American imperialism. They also strengthened his security apparatus, which became one of the most effective in the world, though also one of the most oppressive. The human cost is harder to calculate. CIA officers who participated in the operations had their careers defined by failure. Cuban exiles who volunteered as assassins often ended up dead or imprisoned. Intelligence resources that should have been focused on genuine Soviet threats were diverted to an impossible mission. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent with nothing to show for it except embarrassment. What lessons did America learn? In 1976, President Ford issued Executive Order 11905, which explicitly prohibited political assassination. Every president since has maintained that prohibition, at least officially. The CIA reformed its oversight procedures and became more accountable to Congress. The days of rogue operations run without presidential knowledge were supposed to be over. But the deeper lessons remain ambiguous. The Castro assassination attempts revealed the dangers of obsession in intelligence work, of allowing a single objective to distort an entire agency's mission. They demonstrated the limits of American power. All the money and technology and creativity in the world couldn't kill one paranoid dictator. They showed how intelligence failures can compound, creating cycles of escalation that serve neither security nor policy goals. Perhaps most troublingly, the Castro plots illustrated how easily moral boundaries can be crossed when national security is invoked. The CIA officers who designed poison diving suits and exploding cigars weren't monsters. They were patriotic Americans who believed they were defending their country. But step by step, plot by plot, they descended into actions that violated American values and international law. They partnered with criminals, exploited vulnerable individuals, and designed weapons that violated conventions against assassination. Fidel Castro understood all of this better than his enemies. He knew that every failed assassination attempt made him stronger. He knew that American obsession with killing him revealed weakness, not strength. He knew that surviving gave him power that no amount of speeches or propaganda could match. In the end, the CIA's greatest gift to Castro was its determination to kill him. As we reflect on this strange and disturbing chapter of Cold War history, we're left with uncomfortable questions. How did the world's most powerful nation become so fixated on eliminating one man? What does it say about American democracy that such operations were authorized at the highest levels of government? How do we balance national security with moral constraints when faced with genuinely hostile foreign leaders? The story of how the CIA tried to hunt Fidel Castro is ultimately a story about the corruption of power, the law of unintended consequences, and the limits of violence as a tool of policy. It's a reminder that intelligence work, stripped of accountability and moral constraints, can become indistinguishable from organized crime. It's a cautionary tale about obsession and the inability to admit failure. Fidel Castro is gone now and Cuba is changing. But the lessons of this bizarre cat-and-mouse game remain relevant. In an age when targeted killings by drones have become routine and assassination has been sanitized through technology and euphemism, it's worth remembering the exploding cigars and poisoned wetsuits, the desperate schemes of an agency that lost its way in pursuit of one impossible goal. The CIA failed to kill Fidel Castro 600 times. But in failing, they revealed something important about the nature of power, the price of obsession, and the enduring truth that some problems cannot be solved by violence, no matter how creative or persistent the attempts. If this story of Cold War intrigue and impossible survival fascinated you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of espionage, conspiracy, and the hidden history that shaped our modern world. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most bizarre intelligence operations. And leave a comment below. What other Cold War secrets should we investigate next? Share this video with anyone who loves spy stories, history, or tales of the impossible. Remember, the truth is often stranger than fiction, and history is full of stories that need to be told. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never stop exploring the mysteries of our past.